February the 27th, 1943. The Vemork hydroelectric plant clings to a cliff face in the Telemark region of Norway, 400 meters above a gorge so deep and so sheer that the Germans guarding it consider the approach impossible. Snow falls steadily. The temperature sits at -20 degrees Celsius. 9 men move through the darkness in white camouflage suits, each carrying explosives, weapons, and rucksacks packed for a journey they may not survive. Below them, the Måna River roars through ice. Above them, on a suspension bridge, German sentries patrol with rifles slung and breath visible in the cold. The 9 men do not use the bridge. Instead, they descend into the ravine itself, cross the half-frozen river on foot, and begin the brutal climb up the far side of the gorge, an ascent so steep that the Germans never bothered to fortify it. This is Operation Gunnerside, and the men climbing towards Vemork are Norwegian commandos trained by the Special Operations Executive in Britain. Their target is not a weapon, not a factory line, not a fuel depot. Their target is a substance so obscure that most soldiers on either side of the war have never heard of it: heavy water, known chemically as deuterium oxide. What makes this raid extraordinary is not the daring of the climb, though that alone would justify a place in military history. What makes it extraordinary is the reason for the mission. British and American intelligence have concluded that Nazi Germany is pursuing a nuclear weapons program, and that heavy water, produced at Vemork in greater quantities than anywhere else on Earth, is a key ingredient in that pursuit. If the raid fails, the theory goes, Germany may gain a substantial head start in the race towards an atomic bomb. The 9 men reach the plant. They locate an unlocked cable duct, slip inside the high-concentration electrolysis chamber, and place their charges without firing a single shot. Then they vanish back into the Norwegian wilderness, several of them skiing more than 400 kilometers to neutral Sweden to escape. Not one member of the demolition party is killed or captured. This is the story of the Norwegian heavy water sabotage campaign. A string of raids, betrayals, near misses, and extraordinary endurance that today is widely regarded as one of the most significant acts of industrial sabotage of the Second World War. Whether it actually stopped Hitler from building an atomic bomb remains a subject of genuine historical debate. But the men who carried it out did not know that at the time. As far as they were concerned, they were racing against the end of the world. To understand why a hydroelectric plant in rural Norway became one of the most closely watched targets of the entire war, you have to understand the strange and unglamorous chemistry that made Vemork so important in the first place. By 1940, physicists across Europe understood that a chain reaction inside uranium could, in theory, release a colossal amount of energy. What they had not settled was how to sustain such a reaction long enough to be useful, either for a controlled reactor or an uncontrolled weapon. Natural uranium contains overwhelmingly the isotope uranium-238, which absorbs the neutrons needed to keep a chain reaction going without contributing much to it. A reactor needs something to slow or moderate the fast neutrons released by fission so that they are more likely to be captured by the rarer, fissile uranium-235 or to sustain reactions in other ways. Graphite could serve as a moderator, and so, remarkably, could ordinary water if the uranium were enriched. But enrichment technology in the early 1940s was primitive, expensive, and slow. Heavy water, in which the ordinary hydrogen atoms are replaced with deuterium, absorbs far fewer neutrons than ordinary water while still slowing them effectively. For scientists trying to build a reactor using natural, unenriched uranium, heavy water looked like the most promising moderator available. The trouble was scarcity. Heavy water occurs naturally in ordinary water at a ratio of roughly 1 part in 5,000, and separating it out requires enormous amounts of electricity, patience, and specialized industrial equipment. In 1940, precisely one facility on the planet produced heavy water at industrial scale, and it happened to sit in occupied Norway. The Norsk hydro plant at Vemork had been built in the 1930s to produce ammonia and fertilizer, and heavy water was, at first, a curious byproduct of the electrolysis process used there, generated almost as an afterthought. Producing a single liter required processing. Roughly 60,000 liters of ordinary water through repeated stages of electrolysis, an absurdly energy-intensive process that only made economic sense at a site with cheap, abundant hydroelectric power. Vemork, fed by a waterfall dropping some 200 meters, had exactly that. When Germany invaded Norway in April 1940, German scientists and military intelligence officers moved quickly to secure the plant's existing stock of heavy water and to dramatically expand production capacity. French intelligence agents had already smuggled almost all of France's own heavy water reserves out of Norway just before the invasion, denying Germany that stockpile, but the production facility itself remained firmly in German hands, guarded, fenced, and closely monitored. By late 1942, Allied intelligence estimated that German-controlled output at Vemork had increased several-fold compared with pre-war levels, and that shipments were being routed to Germany with increasing regularity. To British and Norwegian planners, the equation seemed stark and urgent. If heavy water was essential to a German reactor program, and a reactor program was a plausible pathway towards a weapon, then the destruction of Vemork's production capacity was not a peripheral objective. It was, potentially, a matter of preventing the war's most catastrophic possible outcome. The scale of the challenge facing any raiding party, however, bordered on the absurd. Vemork sat on a shelf of rock accessible from the valley floor only by a single suspension bridge, heavily guarded, mined, and overlooked by machine gun positions. The alternative route, down into the gorge and back up the far cliff face, was considered by the Germans themselves to be effectively impassable in winter, which is precisely why they left it undefended. Getting into the plant was only half the problem. Once inside, saboteurs would need to identify and destroy the correct electrolysis cells among rows of near-identical equipment, using explosives calculated precisely enough to wreck the machinery without triggering an ammonia leak that could kill everyone in the building, including themselves. The first attempt, in late 1942, ended in catastrophe before it truly began. Operation Freshman sent 34 British Royal Engineers by glider, towed by bombers intending to land near the plant and rendezvous with an advance party of Norwegian agents already in place. Poor weather, navigational failure, and treacherous terrain caused both gliders and one of the towing aircraft to crash. Survivors were captured by German forces and, in violation of the laws of war, executed under Hitler's commando order, which mandated the killing of captured commandos rather than their treatment as prisoners of war. It was a devastating loss, and it demonstrated with brutal clarity that a large-scale airborne assault against Vemork was not viable. What was needed instead was something almost the opposite in character: a small, self-sufficient team capable of surviving for months in the Norwegian mountains if necessary, moving with total independence from resupply and striking with surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. The solution came from the Special Operations Executive, the British organization tasked with irregular warfare and sabotage across occupied Europe, working in close partnership with Norwegian military intelligence and the exiled Norwegian government based in London. An advance party of 4 Norwegians, trained in Britain and parachuted into the Hardangervidda Plateau months ahead of the main raid under the codename Operation Grouse, survived a brutal winter in near-total isolation, sheltering in a hut and subsisting for weeks at one point on little more than lichen and the occasional reindeer, waiting for the main assault team. That main team, the 9 men of Operation Gunnerside, were selected and trained specifically for this mission. Several were native to the Telemark region and knew the terrain from childhood, an advantage that proved decisive when the operation depended on route finding through a landscape with no reliable maps. They trained in Scotland on a scale replica of the plant's interior, rehearsing the exact sequence of movements needed to reach the high concentration cells and place their charges, so that once inside the real building, they could work from memory and darkness within minutes. The charges themselves were relatively modest in size, roughly the equivalent of what you might use to demolish a garden wall, but placed with precision against 18 specific electrolysis cells. Detonation cord was cut to carefully measured lengths so that all charges would explode within seconds of one another, maximizing damage before guards could react, while fuse delays gave the saboteurs time to withdraw before the blast. The team's leader, Joachim Runneberg, would later describe the operation as almost anticlimactic in its execution. They cut through a fence, found the unlocked duct that the advance party's reconnaissance had identified, laid their charges, and left. A German guard on his rounds discovered the damage only after the team was already retreating into the gorge. If you're finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a lot more of this story still to come. The immediate operational impact of the Gunnerside raid was substantial. The high-concentration cells destroyed represented the most technically difficult and time-consuming part of the enrichment process to rebuild, and production at Vemork ground to a halt for several weeks. German engineers, working under pressure from Berlin, restored partial output within roughly a month, faster than the Allies had hoped, prompting further Allied action. In November 1943, the United States Army Air Forces launched a heavy bombing raid against the Vemork site as part of a broader campaign against Norwegian industrial targets tied to the German war effort, dropping a substantial tonnage of bombs. The raid caused damage to the surrounding facility and civilian infrastructure, but achieved comparatively little destruction of the heavy water production apparatus itself, which was housed in reinforced sections of the building resistant to conventional bombing. The bombing did, however, convince German authorities that continued production at Vemork carried unacceptable risk, and the decision was made to relocate the remaining heavy water stock, along with production equipment, to Germany. That decision produced the campaign's final and most controversial act. On February 20th, 1944, Norwegian resistance operative Knut Haukelid and his colleagues placed a small explosive charge aboard the SF Ferryman Hydro, a rail ferry crossing Lake Tinger that was transporting the heavy water drums, along with railway wagons, to a connecting rail line for onward shipment to Germany. The charge detonated in the early morning, sinking the ferry in deep water within minutes. Norwegian civilian passengers were aboard the vessel, and several lives were lost alongside the destruction of the heavy water cargo, a fact that the resistance fighters involved carried with real anguish for the rest of their lives, and one that honest accounts of this story do not gloss over. How this campaign compares with German and American efforts of the same period tells you a great deal about how differently each nation approached the atomic question. Germany's own nuclear research program, led loosely by figures including Werner Heisenberg, never achieved a self-sustaining chain reaction, and remained, by most post-war assessments, considerably further from a functioning weapon than wartime Allied intelligence feared. German efforts were also hampered by chronic underinvestment relative to the American program, disagreements among competing research groups, and, crucially, the very shortage of heavy water that Vemork's destruction helped ensure. The American approach, by contrast, poured essentially unlimited resources into the Manhattan Project, ultimately pursuing uranium enrichment through gaseous diffusion and electromagnetic separation, rather than relying on heavy water moderation at all, alongside a separate plutonium production pathway using graphite-moderated reactors. In other words, the Americans solved the same fundamental problem, sustaining a chain reaction with natural uranium, through an entirely different and vastly more resource-intensive route than the heavy water moderation Germany was pursuing. This divergence is central to the historical debate over just how much the Vemork campaign actually mattered. If Germany's program was never close to producing a weapon regardless of heavy water supply, then the raids, however heroic, may have denied the Germans something they were never going to use effectively. If, on the other hand, sustained heavy water supply could have allowed German scientists to achieve a working reactor and accelerate their broader effort, the sabotage campaign may have foreclosed a far more dangerous timeline. Historians remain divided on this question, and honest treatments of the subject acknowledge that divide rather than resolving it artificially. What is far less disputed is the psychological and strategic value the operation held for the Allies at the time. Faced with genuine uncertainty about German nuclear progress, denying Germany the resource believed most critical to that progress was judged worth extraordinary risk, and the men who undertook that risk did so without the benefit of post-war hindsight telling them how close or how far Germany actually was. The legacy of the campaign extends well beyond the immediate wartime calculus. It became, and remains, one of the most studied examples of small-unit sabotage operations in modern military history, cited in the design of Special Forces doctrine in multiple countries for its demonstration of how a handful of highly trained, self-sufficient operators could achieve what a much larger conventional force could not. The endurance shown by the Grouse Advance Party, surviving a Norwegian winter with almost no support, remains a touchstone example in survival and special operations training. Today, the Vemork plant itself still stands, converted into the Norsk Industriarbeider Museum, the Norwegian Industrial Workers Museum, where visitors can see the preserved electrolysis hall and learn the story of both the plant's industrial history and its wartime sabotage. The route the Gunnerside team took down into the gorge and back up the far side remains walkable today, and the steepness of that climb, even without an armed enemy above you, tends to leave modern visitors with a rather more visceral appreciation for what those 9 men achieved in darkness, in winter, under threat of death. So return for a moment to that cliff face on the night of February 27, 1943. 9 men, having crossed a frozen river most people would consider impassable, climbed a rock face the German garrison considered undefendable, and walked into one of the most heavily monitored industrial facilities in occupied Europe without firing a shot. They placed their charges, they withdrew into the gorge, and several of them skied hundreds of kilometers across a frozen, occupied country to reach neutral ground. Not one of them died in the attempt. Whether their actions changed the ultimate course of the atomic age is a question historians will likely never fully settle, because it requires knowing how a German nuclear program that never happened might have unfolded. What is not in question is the risk those men accepted, the endurance they demonstrated, and the precision with which they executed one of the most difficult sabotage missions of the entire war. In a conflict defined by industrial-scale destruction, machines built to kill by the tens of thousands, it is worth remembering that one of its most consequential acts was carried out by 9 men, on foot, in the snow, armed with little more than explosives, training, and an unshakable conviction that the mission mattered. They climbed into the dark not knowing whether Germany was close to a bomb or nowhere near one. They climbed anyway. That, in the end, is the story of Vemork. Not certainty,